So when it comes to programming, I think of large language models, LLMs, things like ChatGPT, as a kind of bridge. So that's how I think of it in my head at this point. They have a vast knowledge and vocabulary, so they can help bridge between the very imprecise task description that we start with as programmers and the extremely precise programs we need to output. So going back to our definition of what is programming, taking this imprecise definition, creating a precise set of repeatable steps, I think of large language models and ChatGPT as essentially a bridge between these things. They have tons of just knowledge, right? And so they can kind of go from this really vague, imprecise definition and help create a more precise definition. But at the same time, ChatGPT definitely can't just write good, high quality React applications completely for you, at least not yet. But it can help accelerate the process by being that bridge so that we as programmers don't have to do that as much. So I've been able to successfully use ChatGPT for a number of things related to programming, including writing drafts of some types of source code, summarizing or explaining source code. I used it to write some tests, writing documentation, learning how to code actually. And the biggest benefit I've found is just generating ideas for code or discovering alternate ways of coding something. And I will say too, I think that there's a lot of potential here once these AI programs are able to be more fully integrated into our development environments. I've definitely gotten better results sometimes when I'm able to provide more code from my project to ChatGPT. Although I will say this definitely needs work still, as sometimes it just seems to confuse ChatGPT and I get much worse results instead. By far the biggest thing, and this makes sense now that we understand how these AIs work, is that including more details and being more specific will yield the best results. By default, like ChatGPT just takes whatever request you make to it and spits out a result. It doesn't ask for follow-up questions or try to get more details. Essentially, I think of the process that I go through as like programming ChatGPT. So programming ChatGPT doesn't require as much specificity as actually programming a computer, but it definitely does better the more specific you are. But what I found is then it kind of becomes almost like another programming chore to specify all the details that you need to get good results. So researching into that problem, I discovered a really cool technique where you can actually use ChatGPT to help you write prompts for ChatGPT. So it's kind of funny if you think about it. It's almost like using ChatGPT to help you write programs to program ChatGPT. That's kind of the way I think of it. And I actually use this technique pretty much exclusively. So I have a big generic ChatGPT prompt that I paste into a new chat that tells ChatGPT to ask questions and help me refine a new prompt that I can use later to get the actual result that I want. So, and I will include this prompt that I use on the podcast website. If you want to use it for yourself, you're free to do so. But it's really been a game changer for me when it comes to effectively using ChatGPT. So before I used this technique, ChatGPT would not really give me very good results a lot of the time. And it would be this long process of getting it to refine its results, and it would often get confused. But doing this like two-step process where I first start by using ChatGPT to develop a good prompt and then start a new chat with that prompt has led to much better results much more quickly. I'm not like sitting there forever being like, oh, no, ChatGPT, I actually wanted to include this and this and this too, and then waiting for it to regenerate this big long response in code, and then being like reading through the code and be like, oh no, I forgot to tell it about this too. And like that just, it's kind of slow and didn't really help. But this two-step process where it's like using ChatGPT to create this really detailed prompt to later send to ChatGPT really helped dramatically. For example, I have used this when I've been working on some updates to the React Show website, which is written with Next.js in React. And I used it for an API route for creating accounts. So I have this, I'm working on this thing where you can create accounts on the website. It's not live yet, but I've been working on it. And I pasted my code for the API route, not the client side part, but like the API side part, right? That's essentially just Node.js code, right? So I pasted this into ChatGPT, and with this prompt process, I asked it to respond with any security vulnerabilities that it sees. And one of the things it suggested was that I add a rate limiter so people couldn't use it to help them log into an existing account or figure out which accounts exist and don't exist, that kind of thing. Something I would have included, but hey, it was good to see that ChatGPT figured that out. So then I went through this whole prompt creation process with it to develop a prompt to have ChatGPT create me a rate limiting library that could be integrated into the code that I had already given it. And this was definitely one of the biggest successes I've had with ChatGPT. So I went through this process and created this really long prompt that was basically like, here's all the features I want in this library. I want you to take advantage of any open source libraries that exist to already provide this functionality, and just if you just need to glue it into my existing code, do that. And a whole bunch of stuff like, hey, I want the API to support this, and I want it to have this type of style. And I gave it some example code, and I went through that. And it actually generated a really good solution. And I actually had it generate me a few solutions, and some of them were really good, and I'm trying them out and they worked. And yeah, so that was a really good experience. I've also used it. Probably the other really good experience I've had with it is using it to help me write Cypress integration tests for the sign-in and account creation pages. This actually saved me quite a bit of time and was probably, like I mentioned, one of the biggest time savings I've gotten from it. Although I should say that the tests it created, I think they'll be a little bit less maintainable than ones I would have created. But I didn't have any tests at all, and this wrote the tests for me in probably 1/10 the time it would have taken me to write all the tests. So basically, this meant me having tests versus not having tests. So it was a big win. Of course, this goes back to a whole question of like budgets and how much time we have to invest in things. If I had a whole team working on this, I would rather have them write these tests than ChatGPT at this point, because I think they would do a better overall job. But it's just me, and having tests definitely helped me catch some bugs that I didn't catch at this point. And so it was definitely a big win. Let's see, I've also pasted code into ChatGPT and had it provide some refactoring suggestions. This didn't, I did not have a lot of success with this one, I'll be honest. Like, it helped me find a couple things where I was like, yeah, I could do that. But like overall, I wouldn't say this is that strong suit. Another thing that I did that actually did work better was pasting in code and having it output that code again, but with documentation. This took a little bit of trial and error, because at first it was like just documenting every single line, even really obvious lines, or it was just pointless to add pointless documentation to it. But what I learned was that it was really, really good at providing summary type documentation for code, which, going back to how these large language models work, makes sense. They're really good at like picking out what that context is and using that to create summaries. So if I was like, hey, here ChatGPT, here's a bunch of code, please write me like a 2-paragraph documentation summary for what this code does, it was actually really, really good at that. And I think this would be one of the biggest uses for ChatGPT. I'm definitely going to take advantage of that in the future. So overall, it definitely takes some practice to figure out how to use it, like with any new tool. And it's definitely not always a win or worth the time, but some things it definitely does speed up the process. So if you haven't messed around with it or anything like it yet, and you're curious, feel free to. I would just say, like, you have to treat it like essentially any other programming tool. Like, there's things it's good at and things it's not good at, and you just got to learn it. But yeah, I'd say in some ways it's definitely sped up the programming process for me. It's not like I've not figured out a way to like just have it produce programs for me and get a good result that would, be something that's long-term and maintainable and extendable and that kind of thing yet. But especially for like self-contained things, like that case where I was like, hey, can you make this rate limiting library that I can use throughout my program? It did that really well. So if there's like smaller functions you need, smaller components, I used it. Yeah. So like creating React components, if it's like, I had mixed success with creating React components. In some cases, with like really self-contained things that I was able to specify really well and didn't depend on new features, then it did well. But like when I was like, hey, can you generate me a page that uses Tailwind and is based on the app, React Server Components feature of Next.js 13, just didn't seem to know what that was. I think because it was trained on stuff before that really existed, that was basically useless. It was not useful results. So there's definitely some limitations there. But I did find there were cases where it did a good job. And again, this is just probably a part of learning what it's good at and not good at, and maybe it'll get better at this stuff over time. But overall, I want to say, I think my biggest use for it and the thing that provided the most value to me was not necessarily just writing code for me. Like you go on the internet and search this stuff and people will be like, oh yeah, wrote the code for me. It made the website for me. I'm pretty skeptical of how well that actually works like for a long-term project. But one of my favorite use cases for it is just to generate ideas for how to do things. So I would be like, hey, can you write me code to do this or whatever? And it'll give me some code. And then there's a button that's like regenerate response. I would just hit that a few times and get a whole bunch of different ways of coding something. This is great as it just gives me ideas for different techniques that I didn't think of and that I can, select the best one and build on that. So by far, this is, I think, the most valuable use I have found for ChatGPT and in the related tools is just generating ideas, things that I didn't think of, like it has the entire knowledge base of, I don't know, GitHub or something, right? And so you're like, hey, how do I do this? And if you have it keep giving you suggestion after suggestion, you'll learn a whole bunch of different ways. You can be like, oh yeah, that way's the best, or that way is the least amount of code, or that way I like that API better, and go with that. I think it'd be a big mistake to just take whatever the first output it is that it gives to you. And yeah, so basically I just sort of take all these outputs it gives me and sort of synthesizes them together. And sometimes I will tell it that. I'll be like, hey, combine all these and take these features, whatever. But definitely, I would say it's a mistake if you just take the first result. But I do need to talk about one big downside I've noticed. And that is that it's easy when you're using these tools to get into a really bad, like, what I call like copy paste mode, where you just stop critically thinking and just start relying on it fully. I've caught myself slipping into this a few times, and the end result was always really bad. You have to keep reading through its output, reading through its code, and thinking critically. There's just no substitute for that yet. And I even noticed this with a friend who was using this. We're like doing some coding together. And I noticed, were slipping into this mode too, where they just like weren't thinking at all. And they just asked ChatGPT everything. Oh, I got an error. Ask ChatGPT. I got this. Ask ChatGPT. And they just stopped thinking. And I was sort of doing it too. And it actually was much slower than if we just used our brain and done programming the way we've always done it. And I think as programmers, it's really easy to look at this tool and start using it and not actually think critically. Like, it's easy to fall into this trap. So my recommendation is just be aware of it and try not to let that happen. Ultimately, ChatGPT and similar AIs, power is, in my opinion, understanding and interpreting context and producing results in like reasonable, grammatically correct English or syntactically correct source code. Like, that's really its power. So things that take advantage of that are where you're going to get the best results. It isn't actually, in my experience, very good at like reasoning like us humans are. And I've even been using ChatGPT 4 and some of the latest ones, and it's better, but honestly, I think it still doesn't compete with humans. But it can be a useful tool.